violators, and the penalties are being treated as, quote, a cost of doing business. In their most recent report, the Office of Inspector General found that even when you narrow it to cases involving animal deaths and other egregious violations, so not your run-of-the-mill violations, the average discounting was 86%. So on average, 14 cents on the dollar was paid. My own analysis has found that these penalty reductions have persisted since the last audit report came out, and in many cases seem to be even worse. And so to give you a few examples of what we're talking about with the discounted penalties, the Alexandria Zoo in Louisiana, these are just a couple headlines of an incident in which critically endangered primates were locked out and froze to death. 2 of the 3 who were locked out died. So they faced a potential $30,000 penalty, and this is the settlement. Ultimately, they paid $1,700. Pretty typical. So that was more than a 94% discount. A few other examples. Buttonwood Park Zoo failed to secure an access door, resulting in an elephant ending up in a snowstorm and suffering injuries to her ears, vulva, tail, and extremities. They paid $777. Kansas City Zoo failed to provide veterinary care to a chimp who had lost 37% of his body weight and ultimately had to be euthanized. They also failed to monitor his food intake and to monitor whether other chimps he was held with were taking his food from him. They paid $4,571, so a little bit higher, but it was still a 77% discount on the potential penalty. Milwaukee Zoo left a gate door open and allowed a male jaguar to enter into an enclosure holding a female jaguar and her cubs. He attacked one of the cubs and killed her. Thank you. They paid $1,300. So many instances of zoos failing to protect the animals who they're holding, or even putting those animals at risk. So one interesting thing about these penalty discounts is that they're done on basically secret worksheets. And I FOIA'd them, the other organizations have FOIA'd them as well, and you can see here the USDA told me that disclosing them might be used to circumvent enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act, but it's already being circumvented. So there is actually a bill pending in Congress called the Enforcement Transparency Act, which was lobbied for by the animal research community, which would require these penalty guidelines to be made public. I don't anticipate that it will go far, but I think it's an area where the regulated industry, the advocacy groups, and others have potential common ground. So very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I want to talk about another issue, which isn't so much an enforcement issue, but it really compounds the enforcement problem. So not only is the USDA not taking enforcement action against facilities in most cases where they find violations, their stated policy is to renew licenses every year. So you need a license to exhibit animals, you need to renew that every year. And even when they know that you're in violation of the law, even if they have an open investigation, even if they go out and document a slew of violations, their policy is to automatically renew your license. And there have been a series of lawsuits brought to challenge that. Even before the lawsuits were brought, about a quarter of a century, the Office of Inspector General flagged this practice as problematic and said that it's reducing assurance that animal care facilities will make required corrections to comply with provisions of the Act to ensure the humane care and treatment of animals. So basically undermining the purposes of the Act because you're rubber stamping despite ongoing violations. The USDA said, we think we're required to automatically renew licenses. We don't think we have discretion when the OIG raised this. In the litigation, there's been, the USDA can't rely on that argument basically anymore. It's become clear one federal court of appeals has addressed this issue, and they have said that the USDA has discretion to automatically renew licenses, but they've also said they have discretion not to do so if they choose to. So that's an important takeaway from that case. There are 2 other appeals pending on this same issue. So just about 10 days ago, the issue was argued in the DC Circuit, and it seems pretty clear the DC Circuit is not going to adopt the same reasoning of the 11th Circuit, which upheld the practice. The 11th Circuit basically bought the USDA argument that yes, you're not allowed to issue licenses if someone's not in compliance, but renewing a license is not issuing a license. And Judge Edwards on the DC Circuit very clearly was not buying that argument. So I don't know how it's going to come out, but I think it's pretty clear that they're not going to go on the same grounds that the 11th Circuit did. And the next month, the issue is going to be argued in the 4th Circuit. So just to wrap up, we have very limited legal protections for animals in zoos, even though by far they have more robust protections than other categories of animals, especially food animals. But I think we need to be very aware that we're not adequately regulating them, and to be careful not to assume that because they're in a zoo and they're on display, they're being adequately regulated. And I have some very concrete policy recommendations, and happy to discuss those further in the Q&A.
So just quickly, before we jump over to Ron, Dale and Delcy both mentioned the AZA. And for those of you who don't know, that's the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And it's the most well-known accreditation organization. It accredits about 10%, I believe, of the zoos that the U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees. So it's a small group, but they're kind of the biggest zoos that we know. So I just wanted to clear that up. But Ron, you can take it away if you're still with us.
Well, good evening, everybody. Right now, I can see the ceiling. I can't see you. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks. I'm very jealous that I'm not there with you, because I would love to be in a more organic conversation, which I'm sure will happen after the panel ends this evening. And I have enormous respect for the people, the other folks on the panel, and have served with them on other panels. So I think this is a very rich discussion. You know, I can't begin to tell you how many things I want to share with you, and yet I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to pick what I think are the most important things. And I'm going to try to say a little bit more, I guess not really theoretical, because we're pretty obsessive about being applied in terms of welfare and ethics, but I don't want to get into the minutiae. I will start by saying, for instance, as Delcy knows, I don't think zoos should be regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There is an intrinsic conflict of interest, since they are also meant to promote agribusiness, including that which relates to animals. So I think it should be a part of the Department of Justice. And I do believe that the fundamental issue and the fundamental challenges relate to ethics and welfare. So, you know, to some extent, the question of zoos and their future is really about, you know, what do we mean by zoos? And I think if we're talking about historically what zoos have been, then I would say there's absolutely no future for zoos, because zoos are a reflection of society. And our society, fortunately, is changing. I don't think zoos and aquariums are changing anywhere nearly fast enough, and I say that to my own staff all the time. So I think it is definitely hard, and one of the reasons, I'm giving you my thoughts, I'm not giving you excuses, but one of the reasons is that we are not alone in shaping people's attitudes and values about nature and the environment. So we have an Academy for Humane Education. We work incredibly hard to get across the fundamental concepts of humane education and treading softly on this planet and treating things with kindness. But, you know, you've also got hundreds of years of literature, and you've got movies, and you've got The Big Bad Wolf, and you've got very popular movies that portray lions as heroes and hyenas as villains. And, you know, I'm not going to go into names of things because I don't want to get in trouble here. I know with a bunch of lawyers, but I think zoos are a reflection of society. They didn't create themselves. They're a reflection of it. And to my way of thinking, I'm pretty excited about the future. I'm very upset about the past. And I think that if we talk about the future, realistically, I think zoos and aquariums can do more zoos than aquariums, but can do incredible good. And I think it takes a fundamental reframing of what your purpose in life is. You know, Dale knows that I agree with his concerns, that there's been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of language that's used that is difficult to show the action that correlates with that, whether it's in terms of conservation or science. So I think there's ample room for lots of challenge. I also think we need to keep perspective. I realize that tonight the focus is on accredited zoos, and I do want to remind everybody, as Alexis just said, which is unbelievably important, there are 230 accredited zoos and aquariums in the United States. That leaves another 1,800 that aren't. And we ought to be unbelievably concerned with all of those. They aren't transparent. You don't know most of the time about what happens there. I don't know most of the time what happens there. Periodically, I've reviewed reports in the DNR and USDA, and there are places where you can handle a bear cub, and if you read the reports, you find out that, you know, when the bear cubs get a little bit older, they quote-unquote harvest the bears. You know, this is pretty egregious stuff, and so, and I think about the other forms of animals and entertainment in society. You know, we have been battling circuses. I applaud all of you because I know what you're trying to do in New York, and I think you know that we're committed to doing whatever we can to be helpful on that front. But my goodness, the other evening I had a rodeo on TV, and I'm just bewildered that that still happens in the United States. You know, we all freak out about bullfights, and Spain's already changed their laws on that, but how on earth do we tolerate rodeos, which are blatant abuse and suffering of animals? In zoos, you must understand, while the concerns, and especially the specifics that Delcy raised, are very troubling. I've been in this field a long time. I know that everybody who's working in accredited zoos and aquariums is trying very hard to do the right thing. That doesn't always mean it works, but people have goodwill and mean to do well. I think there has not been enough openness about whether the things that are done are in fact doing the things that we hope they will. But I think if you focus a little bit on where we are and where we're going, and you understand that we could and we do shape to some extent people's attitudes and values about nature, there is an opportunity for us to actually be incredibly good, both for animals and for society. We view ourselves first and foremost as a sanctuary. So first of all, there's, for instance, very little breeding that goes on at our zoo. Now, there are ethicists who will argue, well, that's unethical because you're preventing animals from having sex. You know, that's not necessarily true, but we do have a lot of animals on birth control. But we view ourselves more as guardians, and we view ourselves as trying to help the public understand important issues, whether it's recycling. You know, our zoo is entirely powered by renewable energy. Our wonderful boardwalk is made out of recycled plastic. And all of our newest parking lot is permeable pavement. We do an enormous amount in terms of environmental stuff. That doesn't directly help our individual animals, and that is fundamental to the discussion tonight. But I want you to understand that there is a much bigger context here, which is that we can be the public place that gets people to understand what the issues are and what the solutions are. Our biggest quote-unquote attraction is the new Penguin Conservation Center. The entire facility looks like a spectacular tabular iceberg in Antarctica, and it's cracked in half with a waterfall running down, and it's the story of climate change. That's a $31 million investment to help people by getting them intrigued and excited to understand climate change and what's going on, and to have, to stop this silliness of denial. Now, once you go into that building, I want you to know, I've been to Antarctica 5 times. I've spent a lot of time there. I love it there. It happens to be extremely harsh and extreme, obviously, but having spent a lot of time with penguins in Antarctica, and now in our new facility, I can tell you, if I was a penguin, there is no way in the world I would want to live in Antarctica. I would want to live in our facility. Now, can I say that about everything? No. And that's the goal. The goal is that we have to get to a point where anything that we have has a life that is at least as good, if not better, than life in the wild. And you all know that life in the wild, frankly, life in general, for any animal, and that includes us, is filled with challenges. You don't have full freedom, I don't have full freedom, no animal has full freedom. It's not a justification to take animals out of the wild. We don't take animals out of the wild. We actually do put animals into the wild. So we have lots of reintroduction programs, primarily with amphibians. We have a big investment in something called a Partula snail, which our dear friend Mark Beckhoff is so excited about, because we don't just do the charismatic megavertebrates. We try to do rescues, and whether it's literally a rescue or whether it's conservation programs with things that are critical to ecosystems, and we try to be creative about how to get the public to get excited about something that's a creepy crawly thing. So the Wall Street Journal, as an example, has called our National Amphibian Conservation Center Disneyland for toads. I love that. That was almost a $10 million facility, and since then we've been spending probably $2 million a year on amphibians and on amphibian conservation and real conservation. We've released, I think, 20,000 Puerto Rican crested toads so far back into the wild that's now protected, Wyoming toads, many others. So the reality is, zoos don't have to be what they were. There is a paradigm, in my view, which is a very powerful one, that is great for society and great for nature, as long as it starts with what's best for the animals first. And obviously, the moment an animal is in human care or in captivity, we take on an enormous responsibility, and we've got to deliver on that. So for us, these laws are taught, that Delcy was mentioning, adequate in the laws, the Animal Welfare Act. I mean, what an awful thing to say. We need to provide optimum conditions, optimum physical and social conditions for animals if we keep them in captive environments, whether it's a zoo or anywhere else, just as you do if you have a pet at home. And that's our goal. So yes, there are also tragedies that happen, there are accidents that happen, and I think anytime any of those happen, any of our colleagues will tell you, it's gut-wrenching. Does it, in and of itself, undermine the premise of having zoos and aquariums? I don't know. It's a horrible thing, and accidents do happen. It's not, you have to get to a point where that is zero, which is very difficult to do. I think I should stop there to stay within the time frame and allow us to have plenty of time for the joint discussion.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. I prefer to stand. I spent 15 years as a municipal lawyer, tethered to my seat and a microphone. So every chance I get to stand up, I'd like to do that. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I'd like to take us on a different path from the trail that has been set so far. And by three very distinguished colleagues. And this is Ralph Waldo Emerson: do not follow where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path, and leave a trail. First, I'd like to thank the City Bar. Lori and Jan is standing up to receive my gratitude for video taping this. Mikki and Alexis and Ruth Ross, who persisted for quite a while to get me to participate.
Thank you.
So if I say anything worthwhile, Ruth is responsible, and all the mistakes are mine doing. And Chris, our timekeeper. I'd also like to thank each of the members of the panel who have contributed to my evolution and development over the years. I first got involved in this work in the marine mammal and zoological community in 1989 because of a close-up experience with a dolphin and cancer patients and cancer survivors. The dolphin a little bit inspired me, and the cancer patients and survivors frankly inspired me, and they really humbled me because at that point, and I worked just across the street back then, I thought I had it tough because I was being well compensated to work very hard. So it really changed my perspective on life. Back then, after that transformative experiences, one of the things that I first did was study the animal rights literature. And many of my colleagues in the zoological and marine mammal worlds laughed at me for that. But one of the first things that I read was Professor Jameson's Against Zoos. And I've appreciated his work over the years, even if I've had differences with it. Ron I've known for many years, been frustrated and differed with him at times, been honored to be a part of one of his outstanding symposia through the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare at the Detroit Zoo. And I've come to appreciate the vitality of the model that he's developed in Detroit. We may still have differences, but I have a lot of respect for what he's done. Delcy, not only does she continue to educate me with her work on the Animal Welfare Act, which is sort of the one thing that I've thought about every day for the last 20 some odd years, but back when she was a law student at NYU, she did the best animal law and environmental programs anywhere that anyone did, and I was thrilled to be able to attend those. So each of these panelists have contributed to my evolution, even if we don't necessarily agree on everything. Though there are some common values that we share in terms of animal interests and welfare. And I'd also like to thank those people who, as Ron's noted, within the zoological community, who put their heart and soul out there every day to do their very best for the animals in their care. And doing their very best, things still may fall short. But there are a lot of great people that I don't think get the recognition and support, and sometimes are the beneficiaries of some of the assaults on their organizations that may have a basis. But sometimes I think it's directed at the wrong folks. So bearing in mind the profound ethical challenges and concerns that have been touched upon here. Again, our premise tonight, and I love this from Darwin, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. The cultural change we're talking about, the change in terms of how we view animals, our collective and individual consciousness about animals. And this leads me to my theme for tonight, what I consider inspiring change to better serve animal interests and animal well-being. This George Bernard Shaw quote is perfect, except that I think it's framed too negatively for me. But it makes a point that progress requires change, and that those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. The important thing there, and I think what's most powerful about that, is Shaw is focusing on the fact that change begins with ourselves. It's not with someone else, it starts with ourselves. And I think that's really the story of my journey in animal law. This is one of the models that I've developed for dealing with conflict and challenges within the zoological community, or frankly within animal law. And in order to take constructive action, no matter what is going on, whether it's a complaint, whether it's an ethical challenge, think about ways in which I can improve. Instead of having that default reaction that, let's say, Delcy, just for example, we have a difference of opinion. Rather than blaming that difference of opinion on Delcy or Professor Jameson or even Ron or any one of you, what is it that I can do better? And how can I use that and this situation to better serve animals, then make those ideas better, try and do it collaboratively, take action collaboratively if possible, keep focused solely on getting better and helping animals, and be grateful that we have the ability to change and improve ourselves and to find ways to help animals. This, one of my favorite authors, Steve Chandler, and I share a publisher with him now, this is really how we make the segue from ourselves to others. It all starts with us, motivating ourselves. But as Steve Chandler says, when you look back at things, and I wish I had learned this earlier in my parenting years, because it would have been more effective. It's not, it's really through inspiration. And as Steve Chandler says, it never occurs through somebody criticizing you, fixing you, making you wrong, hurting your feelings, making you defensive. That's not an effective route to change. It will not change another person. And again, everything that I'm sharing here tonight is directed as much to me, and probably more so than anyone else in the room. Simple premise about compassion, dignity, and respect. I think we would all agree getting more people to treat more animals with greater compassion, dignity, and respect, however we may operationalize that, may differ somewhat in certain contexts for some people, is more likely when we treat each other with greater compassion, dignity, and respect. Sort of a variation of the golden rule, very basic. This is a lengthy quote that's often invoked. I think Wayne Pacelle in The Humane Economy uses the second one. This is from paragraphs 91 and 92 of Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, where basically he talks about how we treat each other will reflect how we will treat nature or the environment, and how we may treat or practice cruelty towards other creatures will eventually shade how we treat each other. And I call this Pope Francis's one heart approach, because he says, we have only one heart, and the same wretchedness which leads us to mistreat an animal will not be long in showing itself in our relationships with other people. And again, the same holds true whether it's people or non-human animals. Again, I love the great law of peace, respect for all life, human and non-human, is the foundation. Here, as we've already talked about, the importance of zoological animal welfare or well-being. It's essential to maintain the goodwill of the public, to uphold the public trust. It's congruent with and is necessary to have the moral authority to do the things that Professor Jameson itemized as sort of the classic justifications for the zoological community: conservation and humane education, research, and again, to me, the two most important types of research are that which are in furtherance of enhancing animal welfare and has conservation implications, and animal rescue as well. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's always the right time to do the right thing. So how do we get all of us together? Not coercively, but through inspiration. Now, I think this question helps us do that, and that is, what can we, meaning each one of us here in this room individually, and all of us collectively, do today, meaning now, because it's only right now in this moment that any of us is capable of acting to improve the well-being of animals, which I think is something that we probably would have a very strong consensus that we'd all would like to do. Excellence beyond compliance is a form of paradigm shift, not unlike what Ron has spoken about and what Ron has done in Detroit. And it starts with the minimum standards of the Animal Welfare Act. And then you have, in the context of, let's say, AZA accredited institutions, the overlay of accreditation or self-regulation and higher standards. And then Excellence Beyond Compliance does a few things. One, it makes continuous improvement in animal welfare the #1 overriding daily priority, explicitly. Ron is the CEO of one of the small number of zoos that actually has explicit reference to animal welfare in their mission statement. And many of the zoo leaders that I've talked to said, well, it goes without saying. And I always say that if it's that important, you ought to name it and put it out there to the world and hold yourself accountable for it. And even with accreditation, and even with the gold standard of accreditation, that's AZA, there are a couple of gaps. One is that the greatest impetus for positive change is every 5 years when you're reaccredited. The second one is that you can pass accreditation, Mikki, if I may, by the thickness of this name tag, and 5 years later, pass it again by the same narrow margin. And what Excellence Beyond Compliance does, again, is institutionalizes that drive for continuous improvement based on critical self-assessment and leveraging every step in the Animal Welfare Act process and every challenge, every bad thing that may happen, whatever the cause, as a means for improvement. Some of the things that I suggest are every zoological organization should have an animal welfare officer at an executive level position. Ron in Detroit has Stephanie Allard, the director of the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare. Having someone at an executive level who reports to the CEO, whose job every day is to find ways to make animals' lives better, is absolutely essential. Likewise, having an animal welfare leadership group, which is not just your caregivers and veterinarians, but everyone, because as we've heard here in terms of some unfortunate incidents, sometimes it may be your safety and security people, sometimes it may be your maintenance people that have a role and can contribute to making animals' lives better. Again, everyone can make a difference, and unlike the Animal Welfare Act, which only basically regulates mammals and birds. So birds are covered but not regulated or enforced. Excellence Beyond Compliance recommends that everyone apply their animal welfare and Excellence Beyond Compliance program to every resident animal species. Again, one of the things that happens here